Hello, good afternoon, everybody. We're so happy to see you here. I'm just going to say a few words about the park lecture. The Seong-Yawng Park and Margaret Clark Park Memorial Lecture was made possible by a generous gift from their estate. The principal objective of this gift is to foster the study of Korea at Yale by bringing recognition of the Korean peninsula and its affairs and achievements both to Yale and to the wider community. The Parks met at Yale and were married in 1964. And in an interview Park gave in 2002, he said that coming to the United States and studying at Yale was an experience that shaped his entire life. Park earned his PhD at Yale in 1965 and then taught economics at the University of California, Berkeley. In 1968, he returned to Seoul to work as an economic advisor to the president of Korea. And he also taught economics at Seong-Yawng University. In 1984, he took over the helm of Kumho after his father, who was its founder and chairman, passed away. Park continued to build this transportation, construction, and electronics company, establishing Asiana Airlines in 1988 and thereby forming the Kumho Asiana Group. The inaugural Park Memorial Lecture was by Victor Cha, Professor of Government and International Affairs at Georgetown University. Carter Eckhart, Seong-Yawng Professor of Korean History at Harvard University, gave the second Park Lecture, and Jin Y. Park, Professor of Philosophy and Religion at American University, gave the third. And today it is our great pleasure to welcome Laurel Kendall, who is our first anthropologist to give the Park Lecture at Yale. So thank you so very much.
Okay, thank you so much for coming. My name is Hwan-Soo Kim. I teach Korean religion and culture in the Department of Religious Studies. And it's a great honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Laurel Kendall. Dr. Kendall is the curator of Asian ethnographic collections at the American Museum of Natural History and a senior research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University, and also a former president of the Association for Asian Studies in 2016 to 2017. She earned her BA from UC Berkeley, as well as her 2 MA and a PhD from Columbia. She is an uncontested, unparalleled authority on the subject in Korean shamanism. And her broader research ranges from shamanism and gender relations and religious practice and material religion in East and Southeast Asia. Dr. Kendall began her passion for Korean studies when she was working as a Peace Corps in 1970, when I was born. That's a long time ago. And she encountered several female shamans through their ritual performances. And this encounter led her to 3 decades of anthropological fieldwork, resulting in 3 groundbreaking monographs. First, Shamans, Housewives, and Other Restless Spirits, Women in Korean Ritual Life, published in 1985, examines Korean female shamans with a special focus on gender relations. Her second book, Life and Hard Times of a Korean Shaman, published in 1988, details the life of a Korean shaman, Youngsu's mother, who became a close informant and her friend, but who passed away last year, unfortunately. Lastly, Shamans, Nostalgia, and the IMF, South Korean Popular Religion in Motion, published in 2009, traces the evolution of Korean shamanism from being disparaged as superstition in the 1970s to be embraced as a religion and ultimately being loaded as a fundamental part of Korean culture in the 1990s. And actually, I have been using this book for over like 10 years for my class, Religion and Culture in Korea. In addition to her expertise in Korean shamanism, Dr. Kendall has also published a book on gender titled Getting Married in Korea in 1996. This book concerned how matches are made, wedding rites are conducted, and families finance and carry out the requisite exchange of ceremonial goods in South Korea. The book shed light on the changing marital roles of Korean women in a society rapidly transformed in the late 20th century by industrial capitalism and the emergence of a full-blown consumer culture. Dr. Kendall's most recent work concerns the production and consumption of sacred objects in contemporary market economies, and she has conducted extensive fieldwork in South Korea, Vietnam, Myanmar, and Bali. And this research resulted in a book, Mediums and Magical Things, Statues, Paintings, and Masks in Asian Places. This book was published 2 years ago, in 2021. This book describes how material images give form and presence to otherwise invisible entities, and how sometimes these objects are understood to be enlivened, agentive on their own terms. In addition to her 5 monographs, Dr. Kendall has also edited and co-edited 6 volumes. It could be more. And also at the American Museum of Natural History, she has curated several exhibitions, including mythic creatures, dragons, unicorns, and mermaids in 2007, and Vietnam, Journeys of Body, Mind, and Spirit in 2003. And the second exhibition was a unique collaboration with the Vietnam Museum of Ethnology that earned Dr. Kendall a friendship medal from the Vietnamese government. Although I have respected your scholarship for a long time, this is the first time I have had the pleasure of meeting in person. In fact, in addition to today's talk, Dr. Kendall has kindly agreed to give a keynote speech at the upcoming IHWA and Yale conference in Seoul, scheduled for May 26th. And after the conference, all the participants, including Dr. Kendall and I, will have a week-long trip in South Korea, field trip, including places like Jeju-do, Busan, and Gyeongju. And my colleagues and I are very looking forward to spending ample time with her. It's so wonderful to have you here today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laurel Kendall.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, for that gracious introduction. And I consider it a great honor to be here today as part of this distinguished lecture series. This talk introduces, got ahead of myself. This talk introduces the Comparative project. I will be looking at Korea, but not just at Korea. Vietnam is a part of it. And there will be a few words about Myanmar and also Bali, Indonesia. The project resulted in a book with Burmese nut spirits on the cover. It addresses a challenge posited by anthropologist Webb Keen. He says, here is anthropology. Here you have an innately comparative discipline. It's been comparative from the moment of its birth. And yet, anthropologists today are absolutely squeamish about doing overtly comparative work. We are embarrassed by the inscriptions of our Victorian forebears and not happy with the supposedly controlled comparisons of mid to late 20th century anthropology. A bid to be scientific with what were, in the end, apples and oranges, insufficiently contextualized by their roots and trees. If I could do anything differently in the final chapter of my first book, well, it would probably be to not write the final chapter, which is a place where I attempt to make a gendered comparison of rituals, gods, ghosts, purity and pollution in Korea, China, and Japan, in ways relatively innocent of historical, geographical, and class variation within Korea, China, and Japan. It was the big statement I needed to, at the time, to get a publishing contract, but in retrospect, a mistake. I will stand by the rest of the ethnography between these covers, but chapter 8 is an embarrassment, an artifact of another time. I have worked with Korean shamans since the 1970s, and I have continued to write books about them. The project that I am going to share with you this evening begins in Korea. It begins with Munshin, who are, I would translate them as shamans, not just spirit mediums, but shamans, masters of the spirits. While a medium could be considered something of the spirit's puppet, possessed, entranced, taken over, Munshin are agentive. They are expected to win the goodwill of the gods, to pacify ancestors on behalf of their clients, to mollify troublesome spirits, and cast things impure away from their client's path so that it is open to blessing and good fortune. Their primary work is accomplished in costumed rituals called kut, where they are empowered to make the gods and ancestors a living and speaking presence. The gods of the shaman's pantheon are invisible, but they become a visible presence in two ways. One, they are, through the Munshin's visible manifestations in kut, they're mobile, they're vocal, but this is a temporary presence. They're more permanently present in the painted images that hang above the shaman's altar. More constant, but as we shall see, not completely constant. The paintings were backdrop to my early work, but I did not have occasion to think very much about the images that hung above the Munshin's altar, beyond understanding that these were sacred objects, that they carried the identities of the gods in the shaman's pantheon, and that they were consequential for the Munshin's work. I did hear a story about some paintings of old gods hung behind the altar of the Munshin I call Yongsu's mother. Her sister was also a Munshin, but her sister wanted to give it up because her sister's son said, live with us, but you can't be a Munshin if you live with us. She had dreams, she made prayers. It seemed like the gods that she served were quite willing to go over to Yongsu's mother's shrine and work with her and her gods. Now the shrine was a very narrow space, and so Yongsu's mother took the new paintings and put them under the old paintings. This was after they did all the appropriate ritual, and the gods said, yes, 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 we'll be here, we'll work with you, we'll help you. And so she puts them one under the other, and then things go south. She has illnesses, she has a falling off of business, her clients aren't coming with the usual regularity, or they're coming for a divination, then they're going to another Munshin to have them do the more expensive ritual. And she's having trouble getting a flow of inspiration from the gods who are above her altar. And then she has troubling dreams. Now, in one dream, some women come to her for a divination, 3 women. And one of them sits down, the shaman, she does what a Munchin does when she's about to give an inspiration. She brings out a tray. There's rice grains on it. There are coins. She's going to throw the rice, throw the coins through the configurations. She's going to get some sense of what's going on with the client. She'll ask more pointed questions until she does a full diagnosis. She's doing this empowered by the deity you see at the divination tray in the picture, the Great Spirit Grandmother, who in individual Munchin pantheons is usually an ancestress or a teacher shaman, some shaman in her past who is guiding her in a lineage type way. So the women come in, and one woman sits at the other side of the tray, and the other two, she says, sit down, you know. And they say no, they stand by the door, and she feels very uncomfortable in the dream, you know, that these women are just standing, scowling, and then one of them stalks over, takes hold of that tray, and upends it on the floor, and she wakes up. And she feels really bad because this is the rice that belongs to the Great Spirit Grandmother, and it's like she's been violated. Her primary deity's been violated. So she goes right into her shrine room, and lo and behold, the paintings of her own Great Spirit Grandmother and the painting of her sister's primary deity, the Jade Immortal, they've stuck together and fallen to the floor. And she says, they'd been fighting. And I thought, fighting? Who's fighting? God's fighting gods, paintings fighting paintings, gods fighting each other through the medium of paintings. And I didn't know what was going on. And I put the story of the fallen paintings aside. It remained like a nagging itch. I would come back to it, and I'm going to put it aside for now and come back to it. Fast forward, and I moved to the north of Vietnam early in the new millennium, where in my work as a curator at AMNH, I had an opportunity to work with the Vietnam Museum of Ethnology. Now, we were doing an exhibit called Vietnam Journeys of Body, Mind, and Spirit, and we had various journeys in it, and we thought, well, let's include spirit medium journeys, and we can include the Mother Goddess tradition, which is very rich and colorful, and Phu Sai Temple, the main seat of Mother Goddess worship in the north of Vietnam, donated to the museum for the exhibit the 3 statues that you see in the back there. And they saw this as an attempt to introduce the world to their religion, which had been suppressed under anti-superstition campaigns, but was back and flourishing in the new Vietnam. And then 9/11 happened. And suddenly, there was a bit of an economic crisis in the wake of 9/11. The American economy had actually been sliding a little bit before. And we were told, you've got to cut your exhibit by 1/3. We just don't have the money. And the statues, which I hadn't really met yet, seemed like very good candidates for cutting because they were big, heavy, fragile. The only way we could safely get them to New York would be to buy seats for them on the airplane. So the statues were cut. What do we use in their place? And we felt we should consult with spirit mediums at Phu Sai Temple. So Madame Zuen, the wife of the shrine keeper, very formidable spirit medium in her own right, was going to come and talk to us at the museum. And she was not happy that we were not going to use these spectacular statues. Now, the statues had been kept in storage, and they'd gotten a little dusty, so the conservators, meaning to do a good thing, took them outside, put them on a low platform, and were dusting them. And we were standing around saying, gee, they're beautiful. They're so beautiful. And Madame Zuen arrives, and she walks in. She sees the conservators at work, and she says, you put them on the floor? Would you put Ho Chi Minh on the floor? How can you do that? And profuse apologies ensued. Now, my colleagues were surprised by her reaction because They understood, as I did not understand, that holy images like these statues in a temple setting, they would be animated with the spirit essence of the mother goddesses or a Buddha or whatever, but that these had not been animated, that they were, as they understood it, just statues. And yet, no, they were something more than just statues, and we wanted to find out. Now, the mother goddess tradition of Vietnam interested me, as it interests anyone who knows Korean shaman practice. Because, again, you see the elaborate costumes, you see the sequential appearance of the gods, you see a mimicking of royal dress and hierarchies of gods that parallel temporal hierarchies of kings and officials and so on. So I really wanted to learn more about it. And in 2004, thanks to the Wenner-Gren Foundation, my Vietnamese colleagues and I were able to do a further study. Vu Thi Tan Tam and Win Thi Tu Hung and I went back to Phu Sai Temple and talked to the temple keeper and talked to, about tell us what these statues meant and tell us why it was so wrong to put them low down to try to clean them when our poor conservators thought they were doing a good work. And then we went beyond Phu Sai. We talked to other mediums, we talked to carvers, we talked to a lacquer maker, we talked to people who sold statues in the market. And at the start of many interviews, just to explain what we were about, I told the story of the paintings in Korea that had fought with each other and fallen to the floor. And this was a very good move because this banished any perception that me as an American was going to look down as superstitious, all this stuff that was going on. And that I was open to the idea that images could do things like fight with each other and cause bad luck. And this was the beginning of my education in magical images and the start of a comparative project that would eventually draw in Myanmar and Bali and draw me back to shaman shrines in South Korea and the matter of the fallen paintings. In Vietnam, we were interviewing carvers, spirit mediums, ritual masters, etc., at a very good moment because under high socialism, there had been many acts of iconoclasm. The consequences were very fresh in people's minds. They threw the statues in the pond, and somebody died in a flood. And this woman who was telling me this says, and I have chronic arthritis. If only we hadn't done that to the statues. Also, the market was back. Things were looking up, and there was a felt need to repair, to restore the fallen statues, to repair decaying temples. So statue carving was very much on people's minds. Now, all of my life, all of my adult life, I have been bowing to Buddhas, showing respect. I've been guided in my form by many Korean women. I never realized that the Buddha was supposed to really be there until I began doing this work. I was learning what my Vietnamese colleagues knew very well, that through ritual acts, the statues had been made into social entities. After being ceremoniously placed on the altar, the cavity in the statue body would be filled with animating matter, sometimes regarded as an approximation of human organs, amulets, and other things. And then on a lucky day, in the dark midnight hour of the rat, a ritual master or a monk would bring the statue to life, awakening its senses, opening its eyes. Now, we studied what do you do to make the statue alive, but we also studied the protocols for making this statue, what the carvers and the spirit mediums considered necessary to make a powerful statue, and then the statue's subsequent careers. When I searched the literature, specialized studies from India, from China, from Japan, I was surprised by how widespread these ideas seem to be, that the image is transformed by ritual action into presence, and that the presence becomes consequential. And I was tempted into further comparative work, building my own questions upon an existing scaffold of writing. In Myanmar, I joined forces with Aaron Hasanoff, an AMNH research associate who had been working there with field assistants Pipi Tant and Otete Win to interview spirit mediums and carvers. This was a very, very brief incident, but it helped to round out the picture. And then in Bali, I have had the pleasure of working with Dr. Niwayan Pasek Ariati, a scholar of religious history and a veteran field worker who will also be participating in the Yale conference, just to bring everything home. In Korea, I have usually been a solitary anthropologist, working sometimes with a field assistant. But I was learning the pleasures of teamwork, especially when different people have different kinds of expertise. And when I returned to the question of the fallen paintings, I joined forces with Dr. Jong-Sung Yang, a folklorist, and Dr. Yotsu Yun, an art historian, both of whom have had interesting things to say about shaman paintings. Both of them now have private museums with extensive collections and ties that complemented my ties. All of these collaborations produced co-authored papers in English language professional journals and a co-authored book on shaman paintings. These were cited pieces in the patchwork quilt that would become Mediums and Magical Things, the 2021 book. And because it had worked so well for me in Vietnam, when I met with carvers in Myanmar, I would use the story of the paintings that had fought with each other and fell to the floor in my conversations there, and also with carvers in Bali. I came to imagine this project as a wide-ranging, vicarious dialogue between conversation partners in different places who have never met face-to-face. A carver in Vietnam told me this, I would say. A mask vendor in Bali told me that. In a South Korean shaman shrine, the paintings fought with each other and fell to the floor. I approached this work through three affordances. Affordances like, you think of the handle on the coffee cup. There are all different kinds of coffee cups, all different shapes. But they're, a simple single operation that helps bring the cup to one's lips. And that's how I approached different ways people had of talking about how they make and enliven these images. Birgit Meyer from the field of material religious studies calls for a deeper appreciation of the process of fabricating religious things. And this is my first affordance of most direct interest for a conversation about active matter and its spiritual implications. And this is an affordance that spans what we might think of as the Catholic world, originating but no longer by any means restricted to Europe, and the East, but Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean originally, and the Hindu Buddhist world, way across all of Eurasia, more or less. Throughout this vast Eurasian geographic span, we find places where religious images have long traditions of workshop production, where they have been commissioned as acts of conspicuous devotion and produced to a higher level of skill, where levels of material consumption enable standards and hierarchies of value with respect to materials and craft. Those who commission, install, and subsequently venerate sacred images are dependent, well, in the Catholic word, we don't say venerate the images, but offer prayers and sincerity inspired by the statues. But all right, in both instances, the Catholic world, the Hindu Buddhist world, in the first instance, these things are being made in workshops. You're not fabricating your individual personal religious object. And the critical work then has been entrusted to other hands. But, and this is my second affordance, now we slice that first affordance in half. Significant difference between religious statues in a Catholic tradition and religious statues in a Hindu or a Buddhist tradition, appreciating that these are multiple traditions. Catholic images are considered sacramentals. They inspire prayer. They enable the reception of grace, but they are not, or are not supposed to be, idols. When they show signs of life, they are considered, this is a weird thing, this is miraculous, and or theologically problematic. And instances of statues weeping, flying around, sweating, inspire very serious religious investigation. In the Hindu-Buddhist world, images are made to be inhabited by gods or Buddhas, as you saw in the slide of the Vietnamese carver at work, and there's a cavity in the back. Images in the Hindu-Buddhist world are regarded as presences, consecrated and venerated through appropriate techniques and practices, sacred, powerful, sometimes dangerous, but also material objects that will deteriorate over time. In these places, the relative quality of materials, of craftsmanship, and some practices we might cautiously and heuristically call magic are consequential for the image's subsequent career as an ensouled and agentive thing, consequential for its efficacy or absence thereof. The final affordance in my 4 case studies that fall under the very broad umbrella of sacred images in a larger Asian world are those distinctive traditions of mediumship and shamanship that work in conjunction with the gods or spirits that possess spirit mediums and are manifested by shamans, a doubling of the well-crafted image and the mobile body, as in a Korean kut. So 3 affordances. There's workshop production to a high degree of quality. There's the notion that the statue is made to be ensouled, can be ensouled through ritual practices, can also be de-ensouled. And finally, there are specific traditions where the images work in conjunction with a shaman or a medium. We'll say something about how and why. Okay, this happens in Lendong in Vietnam. This happens in Nhat Pue in Myanmar. And in the Balinese Odalan, the temple festivals, the mask image covers and subsumes the identity of the medium, a blending of image and mobile body when the deity appears in temple festivals. My work, I want to emphasize, thinking of that unfortunate chapter 8 of my first book, this is not going to be a controlled comparison. As will become evident, it was the unexpected answers to otherwise legible questions that made things interesting. In the carving workshops of the Red River Delta of Vietnam, I learned the importance of craft. Using properly seasoned wood and working it with a knowing hand, a knowledge of tradition, a clear vision in the mind's eye to make a proper image. I think thus far, any sculptor would probably say that. Not just good wood and excellent skill, though, but in the most traditional workshops, attentions to things we might consider magic. The wood is cut on an auspicious day and hour set by the lunar almanac, after sending out any ghosts or other unofficial, infelicitous elements that might have taken up residence inside the old wood. And the carver who makes the cuts is endowed with a horoscope that syncs properly with the year, day, month, and hour. The wood is cut to an auspicious measure on the scheme attributed to Luban, the Chinese god of carpentry. The master carver seeks a vision of the intended deity in his own mind's eye before he begins to carve. He makes his workers observe various workshop taboos: no bare chests, no inauspicious talk, no laundry hanging over the statue, no menstruating women touching the statue, no dog meat consumed, no garlic or strong-smelling herbs when the final gilding is applied. Offerings and petitions punctuate the entire process, from the master carver's offerings to the goddess before going to discuss the commission with a potential patron, to the patron's final inspection of the finished statue and request of the goddess's permission to bring it to the home temple. In this process, it becomes difficult to parse the difference between the strictly material practices and things done for other reasons, other consequences. And I want to note, when I speak about magic in Vietnam or Korea or anywhere, these places are not strangers to modern science. This is something else. The statues, like the communion host, are material things whose intended work overflows material logic. A statue will be less efficacious, even inauspicious, where the carver substitutes cheap branch wood for more durable core wood, where improperly seasoned wood rots or becomes infested with insects, where the artisan skimps on the gold lacquer commissioned by the patron, or where the product is simply ugly. If human beings do not punish the carver, the gods will, said one master carver who considers his own work, his scrupulous attention to all these details, as doing the mother goddess's work. Of course, not all images are equally efficacious, nor are they all made with the same care. A shopkeeper on Hanoi's Han Quat Street, a hive for these activities, described a hierarchy of value. She said, the least expensive, the least efficacious, in her view, statues are the ones that are just sort of chunked out, so many types of the 10th prince, and they're all on the shelf, and you come in and you buy one. The next are commissioned through the shopkeeper. I want a 10th prince, and they're more expensive, they're made a little better, they might work a little better, she said. And then the best are the statues made by a master carver using all of the traditional processes I've been talking about. And these, of course, are the most expensive and the most efficacious. Statues like those that had been gifted to the Vietnam Museum of Ethnology had been made according to all the procedures for making, but the process had stopped there. They then were not ensouled, but they could have been. Younger mediums use less expensive statues, and they will say, oh, a statue's a statue. It's the ritual master who puts the god inside. You just need a good ritual master. But the older mediums associated with established temples will say, oh, that's naive. That's even dangerous, assuming that badly made statues are not ling, do not secure the mother goddess's favor, and will bring inauspicious consequences. I would find this kind of argument about what you have to do, no, you don't have to do that, in other places as well. And I see this as kind of a dialogic practice. It is important to point out the disagreements that living people have when it's a living tradition. And this is a symptom of how how real it all is, where the marketplace offers a range of market choices, even for the images of gods. Now, Myanmar is also in the Buddhist world, and albeit Theravada, not Mahayana, and with a different ritual calendar. But from what I had read before going there in 2011, images are also animated. Nut spirits are invested with the nut's butterfly soul and live in close association with spirit mediums who carefully tend them, bathe them, dress them. Note the arrangement in the basket. They've arrived at the festival, and now the statues have not been piled inside the basket, which would be more protective, would also be an economy of space. No, the nuts should see where we're going, so they're out, you know. I had been curious about the Burmese nut play for a very long time. Again, this is another kind of ritual where, like the Korean shaman's kut, like the lendong, it's richly costumed, the gods appearing in this sequence of incarnation that accompanies costuming and departure, decostuming, and on through a sequence. I wanted to see, in terms of this project, if the workshops that carved the medium's small wooden images were attentive to both magic and craft, as their counterparts in Vietnam might be. I learned that in Myanmar, mediums carry their own images with them to rituals as their co-present enablers, and to festivals in the nuts' home temples, where the little images are periodically irradiated by their presence to the source statues, the original seats of the nut. This is a more portable practice than the immobile statue. In Vietnam, the ritual master sets it on the altar. And if, one medium told me she was dusting and she knocked it a little askew and she had pain in her arms and so on and so forth until she got a ritual master in to set it right again. But no, these are quite mobile. They go with the nut jaw, the mediums, and they get a bit banged up. Ethnographies of Myanmar describe their battered condition. I didn't see batter. I saw, as in Vietnam, a moment where people could afford to regild their images, and things were looking pretty good. When we spoke to the carvers near the Mahamuni Pagoda in Mandalay and the Shwedagon Pagoda in Yangon, carvers were familiar with our questions. Yes, the carver should abstain from alcohol and work with a clean body and a respectful attitude, shoes removed as in a pagoda or a monastery. And yes, the statues must be beautifully carved according to a proper prototype. A ritual offering might mark the start of a large and important commission, and depending on the client's willingness to pay, a carver would observe different levels of Buddhist precept. But we soon realized that our interest in nut images was confusing to the carvers we were talking to, who considered the nut a sideline. The Buddha images were where it was really happening. And when they described prohibitions and purifications, they were largely referencing carving a Buddha for a major temple commission. In addition, the form of a Buddha image demands strict adherence to precise protocols set down in texts, while nut images need only approximate the gestures and costumes deployed by mediums. And sometimes a medium will see the nut in a particular gesture in a dream, and that becomes the gesture of the image. One carver said he felt happier when carving the Buddha because he could focus his whole mind on it. The nuts, he said, could be rougher and cruder than a well-finished Buddha image. I have since heard that there is a special fraternity of nut carvers who do take the carving very seriously, but they're a small corner on the supply. It's like in Vietnam, are you going to buy a very elegant statue? Are you going to buy a lesser? But there seemed also to be a bit of a difference between Mother Goddess figures in Vietnam and nut figures in Myanmar. There's such a very clear hierarchization. The Buddha is absolutely central, and the nuts are something else again. Nuts are, relative to the Buddha, they died, most of them died violently, they died through treachery or otherwise badly. These are not spiritual people or spiritual entities. In dying, they were unable to assume a prayerful orientation toward the next life. They were denied reincarnation. As Burma scholars describe them, nuts remain trapped in the emotions and appetites they bore while alive. Where good Buddhists work towards salvation by periodically following precepts, enjoining moral behavior, fasting, temperance, and other austerity, the nuts exemplify the appetites and failings of the flesh in the stories told about them, the corporeal activities they enact via their mediums, and the rowdy and transgressive behaviors of roistering devotees on the periphery of nut festivals. But unlike the transcendent Buddha, nuts are the guys to whom you bring your mundane concerns, your love affairs, your business, your gambling aspirations. You just don't bother the Buddha with that. It's totally improper, but the nuts are there for you. So they get taken care of. Nut images are, of course, cheaper. The wood is of less quality. They can even be made out of plastic, although when I was in Myanmar, it would be virtually impossible to find a Buddha image made out of plastic. This is not an argument that the images are necessarily shabby. They're as nice as the medium can afford. And it's not an argument that, like some traditions, they're intended to decay. No, they're supposed to last as long as they possibly can. Rather, the accessibility and portability of these images is a reflection on the accessibility of the nuts themselves. Acquisition is a personal rather than a community project, the way commissioning a Buddha image would be. And these small and relatively inexpensive images circulate freely. Little nut are carefully tended by their medium and coiffed, in at least some cases, with the medium's own hair. Now, I was ready to go back to Korea and learn more about the images of gods that had been fighting and fell to the floor. Of course, once we turn to the Munshin shrine, we're talking not about statue bodies, but about two-dimensional paintings on laminated paper, and sometimes even cheap, garish, mechanically reproduced prints. Now, I knew that when Munshin install Buddha images on their altars, this is a relatively recent practice, they mimic Buddhist eye-opening rituals or hire monks to do this for them. In the Buddhist world of animation, the container of a statue body has a liturgical certainty. You do the ritual properly, and it should happen. It should be enlivened, so long as the procedures are carried out correctly. But when I asked how the gods enter the paintings, I encountered a certain vagueness. We cause the gods to be there, one Munshin said. And no, there's no special ritual for this. The gods go into the paintings. The Munshin needs them to be there in order to receive inspiration in the form of bright energy, what they call myungi. And this is supposed to happen when the Munshin sees them in front of her eyes as part of the initiation ritual. I realized that back in 1989, Diana Lee and I had actually captured such a moment in our film, and I will share this with you.
그게 이제 천황대왕님이 춤을 추다가 이런 모자가 그게 너 벌써 저 0점으로 주는 거야. 이게 눈에 빌 때는. 아, 내가 천황대왕인데 이거 왜 안 했느냐 이거지. 모자. 어?
그건 신용은 네가 하는
그럼
거야.
그걸 네가 신용하고 네가 말을 하는 거야. 그게 눈에 올 때는 0점이고 옛날 장군들 그렇게 생겼어. 그런 양반이 빌 때는 내가 무슨 장군이다 하고서는 좀 저거 할 때는 작도를 딱 짚고 내가 엄마 아침에 가르쳐줬지. 이렇게 들고 이렇게 하다가 여기도 이렇게 대보고 이렇게 해가지고 야 오르게 되면은 저기다 놓고 발 씻고서는 올라타봐라 내가 그거야.
이름하게 도와주시고 그렇게 우리 이제 앞으로는 노스없이 물리고 앞으로는 내가 서서 들려서 이렇게 내밀려 줄 거야.
네, 옳습니다. 다 오죠, 그럼. 다 오죠. 그럼 잡도에서 안 올르시면 그게 큰일 나게. 다 천지신명 갖고 신명 다 오셔, 이제. 자, 이거 들고, 이거 들고 가서 이제
Okay, she says, if you'd gone up there and nothing had happened, that really would have been a disaster. So what's happened here? She has told her, you have to act like a god to feel the inspiration to be the god. And then it comes through, and she's told, go into your shrine, and now bow, and that connection is established. The gods have taken their seats in the paintings. Like much in shaman practice, though, it is all a bit ambiguous. It's not like you do the ritual, the god's there, the statue encloses it. In fact, the painting is conceptualized something like a seat, and a god can get up from that seat. The gods might not arrive at all, and the initiation might fail, and the paintings go back to the shop. Or a charlatan Munchin performs as though the gods were present in the paintings, but the paintings are empty, and only the other Munchin know this. Or the gods might arrive, but they don't have the force to really make the shaman an effective shaman. As alas, that was the case in the segment you just saw, that poor young woman. She just didn't have enough inspiration to get up the next day and be a shaman speaking on behalf of clients. And she had to work at it further. This is an ongoing relationship, too. The gods are in the paintings, but it's ongoing. It's like a marriage. They might have a falling out. The transmission of inspiration through the paintings might turn staticky because the shaman has done something that displeases the gods. As when Yongsu's mother offended her own gods by bringing in her sister's gods. And she said, and I pray to them, and I used to get this clear flow of inspiration, but when that was going on, it was just static. Or once present gods might depart in a fit of pique, just leave utterly, leaving the Munshin to silence. No voice, no dreams, no visions, no body cues or other intuition. Sometimes the Munshin can make it right again, as Yongsu's mother did, and sometimes not. Some Munshin and the very few traditionalist painters who remain in South Korea consider the careful production of a painting, the painter engaging with the shaman's vision and observing workshop protocols that would be legible in the carving workshops in Vietnam and Myanmar and Bali as essential to the flow of inspiration through the painting. It is said that the paintings by Mr. An, whom you see in this picture, have a very high success rate when they are used in initiation rituals, and this man has more work than he can handle. I interviewed Mr. An and another traditionalist painter, both of whom claimed that they sat with the Munshin until they could share her vision. What did you see? What color was the robe? What gesture was the hand? And when they both feel confident that the painter can reproduce it, and then they bathe, they report to the gods and Buddhas before beginning their work. They live like monks for the duration of the commission in isolation and austerity. Mr. An said, I just don't go outside. I might see an accident, I might see a quarrel, and that would affect the painting, the whole spiritual connection to the project. And both painters related wondrous tales of their engagements with gods and paintings. Munshin, who could afford their work, considered these paintings a mark of distinction and good practice. But in truth, in South Korea, most Munshin use paintings that are either produced in commercial workshops or the commercial prints. When pressed on this point, even Munshin who are proud of their own traditionally produced, very expensive paintings will give primacy to the Munshin's connections to the gods. A Munshin with strong hobby, strong compatibility with the gods, draws them to the paintings and makes them want to stay there. And even some Munshin, she said, could work even with a photograph. The shaman fosters a good relationship with her gods through her own daily devotions. This is her responsibility. And she makes pilgrimages to sacred mountains to recharge her spiritual batteries. This is an analogy that they use themselves. There was a lot of electricity talk in these interviews. I came to see the Munshin's body, the shrine, and the mountain as something like electrical circuitry, the Munshin transmitting back from the mountain to the shrine, to the gods, seated in the images, who provide a steady flow of inspiration in the form of words, bodily sensations, dreams, visions, or probably most often just very sharp intuition. Not a fixed container like the statue, the painted image is also more fragile, mutable. They become soiled with incense and candle smoke and are sometimes gnawed on by bugs or rats. Gods in the Munshin world prefer pure, clean things. When the shaman can afford to replace them, the gods are politely told, can you abandon your seat for a minute? And they take the painting down, burn it, and replace it with a nice clean one and invite the gods back. While statues are tenderly repaired, the painting is in effect treated like an old skin. Paintings from the shrine of a retiring shaman, if not passed to a successor, would be buried with the rest of her paraphernalia in a mountain grave. We do this for people, and we do this for them too. She meant the gods. A Munshin explained that the proper disposition of departed gods enacted through the medium of paintings rotting corpse-like in the ground. Although, of course, the gods had been asked to leave the paintings before they were buried. This lack of fixity, this absence of liturgical certainty, this ultimate reliance on the variable powers of the Munshin to draw the god's inspiration through the painting suggests to me a distinction between the Korean Munshin as a shaman, herself a master of the spirits, fully agentive, in contrast with the Ongdong and Badong of Vietnam, the Nek Jaw of Myanmar, also who for the most part experience trance as more passive vehicles of the divine, the equivalent of the statue container. In other words, by looking outside of Korea and then coming back to Korea again, I saw a productive contrast that affirmed my sense of what Korean shamans are. The success of a kut is very much a matter of the connection between the Munshin and her gods. If she enjoys her favor, and if her gods themselves are powerful, then they send her good inspiration. Her manifestations are compelling. Clients laugh and weep in the presence of gods and ancestors and receive uncannily accurate or at least experientially resonant divinations. The favor that the Munshin receives is transmitted to the favor that the client receives, and the kut is a success. The shaman's own identity and reputation are closely identified with the success or failure of the kut she performs. Now, as an elaboration of this point, here is a brief contrast with the expectations of a divine manifestation by Munshin in a Korean kut and the spirit entities who inhabit masks worn by spirit mediums in temple festivals in Bali. In Bali, local tutelary gods, the Sesuhunan, go to ground in temple masks that have been carefully carved and ritually animated according to exacting protocols, very similar to what I've been talking about. The masks of particular temples gain renown as particularly powerful Sesuhunan. This is Jiro America, a Sesuhunan who resides in the private temple of the former rulers of Ubud. The mask is famous for propelling Jiro America, a medium, through the medium, the mask on the medium, on long itinerating journeys around and beyond the town of Ubud to neutralize practitioners of black magic, to protect the town. I saw Jiro America in action once and heard many accounts of other occasions. The medium was in the innermost courtyard on that one occasion when I was present. The medium was meditating, and it was told to me by people who were there that ahead of schedule, the medium is inspired, puts on the mask, comes down to the temple courtyard, does a few turns, and then runs out of the temple, followed by all these guys who've been waiting for this moment. And they go for the next several hours all through the streets of Ubud, and people fall into very violent trance. It all gets posted on social media, and as was related to me by the people in my hotel who knew where I had been the night before. So I wanted to interview the medium. And using a field assistant's connections with the interior of the palace of Ubud, we were given a name of the spirit medium who we were told had done the ritual. And we spent the better part of a day tracking him down. We chased and chased. He was here, no, he was there. And then finally we got a hold of him. And he said, no, that wasn't me. They thought it was me because I'm a famous guy, but that wasn't me. That was somebody else. Now, that would never happen with a Munshin and a kut. It's her kut and the gods working through her. In Bali, it's the Sesuhunan who've gone to ground in the mask, and it's the mask much more than the medium, albeit the medium is not inconsequential, but that really makes it happen. Okay, so in conclusion, the aim of this journey has not been to make a typology or, God forbid, a particularly Asian interpretation. Rather, it is to present a wide-ranging conversation enabled by some broad general principles about materiality and magic among mediums and shamans, carvers, and painters in my 4 examples. As I move through them, things learned in one place could be productively upended in another domain of popular religious practice. Statue workshops in Vietnam introduced the idea of statue making as an unfolding of craftsmanship, protocol, and magic to produce an efficacious agentive object. The Myanmar example offered a variation on the theme, that images are made more casually and at less cost, material conditions that reflect the nut's subordination to the Buddha and the general accessibility and portability of nut. Balinese carvers would see something of themselves in the Burmese and Vietnamese counterparts. Paper images in Korean shaman shrines counter the gravitas of the statue container with a more ambiguous spirit presence that witnesses the god's more fluid and dynamic relationship with the Munshin. The importance of the Munshin's own agency in sustaining the flow of inspiration, something I would not have appreciated to the same degree had I not used what I had learned in Korea to make questions posed in other places that generated questions and some surprising answers back in Korea. Less a comparison than a dialogue. And speaking of dialogue, I want to end this presentation with an expression of gratitude to my research partners and to all of you for staying with me through this rather long presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. This was fascinating, to say the least. Please excuse my ignorance in advance, but once a statue is ensouled, does the spirit stay in it, or does it leave, and then there's a need for another ritual to call it back?
Okay.
And does it depend on where the statue is? Let's say it's in the temple, therefore the spirit stays.
Yeah.
Could you enlighten us on this?
Okay.
Please?
As I understand it, all the activity around the statue, around the mask, around the, in the 3 places that use carved wooden objects, is on the assumption that the deity should stay. Now, there are occasions where, again, the deity is sent away. You need to repair your statue, and there are special protocols for that. There's also some disagreement. You know, do you have to do a full desacralization if you are just going to repair it inside the temple versus taking it to the carver's workshop? You know, these little nitty-gritty things that people do argue about. I heard stories in one of the encounters that got me interested in all of this, a village where during an anti-superstition campaign, they were ordered to take the statues down and throw them in the village pond. And women described praying, you know, please leave and please forgive us. It's the government that's doing this. It's not us. It's their fault. And, you know, to enable the gods to depart. There are stories throughout the Hindu-Buddhist world. There's some understanding that as in a Catholic statue loses its blessing if it's banged up. And that's, you know, that's not an incarnation. That's just a special grace state. In this world where the gods are there is also some sense that if it's banged up and disrespected, the gods leave. But that's, you know, that has to do with the inadequacy of the material container. Or I guess, you know, true acts of desecration, like iconoclastic moments. So that's an interesting comment. Whereas in Korea, you know, they go up, they go down. You know, it's a much less permanent thing because it's a relationship that has to constantly be reaffirmed.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. This is so interesting. I was wondering if you had maybe a personal experience with Korean shamanism, because I'm assuming you were in close proximity to it, and I wonder if you had the opportunity to experience maybe contacting your own ancestors, just out of curiosity.
My own ancestors? Well, through the shamans, yes. I have sponsored Kut for the dead on behalf of my parents, and I've been addressed by my dead parents who speak much better Korean than I do. And, but, you know, with some Americanisms like okay thrown in. I had one of those twilight experiences where when my father was ill with cancer, I remember him touching my back and saying, "Oh, I can feel your ribs," and me thinking, "You shouldn't be worried about my weight. We're all worried about your weight." And then when we were doing I sponsored a ritual after his death, and the shaman comes up, incarnating, manifesting my father, and feels my back and says, "Oh, kalbi, you know, I can feel your bones, I can feel your ribs." And I thought, whoa, this is weird. You know, how did she, you know, this is, and I thought, it's all in my head. I imagined it, but no, Diana Lee got it on film. I can't say all my encounters are that vivid, but that one stands out for me.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I found myself having lots of different thoughts about different things I've seen over the years that I realize now I probably didn't understand. And my question may well reveal just how little I understand. But I was thinking about stupas and relics and the way so in the Bainiki Library here we have the Hyakumanto Darani.
Yeah.
And my understanding of the efficaciousness of the Dharani was that they were supposed to be the words spoken by the Buddha. And so I was thinking about how all of that works and whether there are connections there. And then it also led me to thinking about the question of mummies. So instead of what we would consider an inanimate object being animated, you have the kind of opposite where what we would have once considered to be an animate object seems no longer to be, and yet continues to be revered as if still alive. Sorry, I'm revealing my own prejudices here with the way I'm saying that, but you know, and I'm just wondering if you see connections there more generally across North and Southeast Asia as well.
Okay, mummies, I will say I know pretty much zero. Are you talking about those traditions where like a Taoist is supposed to eat a certain kind of wood and then their body is preserved from putrefaction, or?
I was thinking mainly of Koyasan and Kukai, who's supposedly still alive. And every day the monks bring him his food, and he's supposedly sitting there meditating hundreds of years later. Sorry, I'm not very coherent. This is not really a question, but I kind of...
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, these are all topics for you or your students to take on. These are, you know, this is all under the banner of material religion. There, you know, as you may know, some people know, my students get very upset when people use the word object because they've all taken a course on thing theory. And if it's not an artifact, you call it a thing because it's so much more than just the material limitations of what it is. And there are so many things that could be studied to, you know, how do people think about them? How do people argue about what they're supposed to think about them? What's the proper care and feeding of such an object? And, you know, there are infinite examples. There's all kinds of interesting work that can be done. With respect to the mummy, I guess the thing most resonant to me is, what is it about the human form? These are all, you know, in one instance, the mask, it's just the head with the medium body, but the others are all, what does it mean to replicate a human form? Does it conjure a presence? Museum mannequins, people have all these night at the museum responses to them because they're human forms and human sizes, not like big statues on pedestals. A lot. It's just a big sea that, you know, to jump in and swim in and get more from.
Thank you. I know nothing about the spiritual world. So it was really eye-opening for me to see that world through things as you did. And I had this preconceived concept that the spirit mediums had this special connection to the spiritual world and the objects as supplements to that world. But the way you paint it is how the no one, including the mediums, can reach the spiritual world alone, and actually they need the objects or paintings to get inspired. Therefore, it's the carvers or painters a critical part of the efforts, and how incredibly communal that effort is, and how it is not an individual relationship to the spirituality. And I imagine that communality, or how the belief, the spiritual relationship is only possible through the communal collective efforts, is heightened and highlighted through rituals. But I was wondering, in a mundane everyday settings, how the kind of collective relationality to spirituality manifests perhaps differently, or how that practiced or felt in that moment when that's not in a spiritual performative moment.
Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you. I mean, these different representations inhabit different socialities, social worlds. In the case of the Korean shamans, every day, in the morning, they burn candles, they offer water. This is so, and they address their deities. And then there is this kind of playful ongoing, the shaman receives a gift, it goes first onto the altar, and its essence gets consumed by the deities, and then she takes it back. Sometimes there'll be a dream. One of the deities in the Munshin I worked with most closely, one of the deities was the person appointed to be that deity was her dead husband, who had been an alcoholic. And every now she described one incident where she gets this wild craving for Korean soju and has to run to the store and put all the bottles under the painting. And so, no, it is ongoing, it is daily, but it's in the more intimate sphere of one practitioner and her deities. Or in Myanmar, the daily tending of these little images. It's almost like doll-like devotion, but I didn't want to talk about dolls because it's so freighted with psychological stuff that I didn't want to impose on the Burmese spirit mediums. But it is a sense of continuous presence. It's just that in the ritual moment, then the deity becomes manifest in the medium or the shaman. And that's it. But the communities are different. When you make, say, a Buddhist image in a community in Myanmar, it's the whole community working on it. When you, feeding the carvers and maybe doing some Buddhist precepts to help everything along. When you carve a mask in a Balinese community, the community is feeding the carver, and there are members of the community who are in the temple meditating before the carving starts. And there's this great sense of collective enterprise. The shaman work and I would say the Nutjo's work is much more individualistic oriented in terms of the relationship on the one hand and the ministry to clients who are bringing their own special problems in.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. I guess my question is sort of remaining in the mundane world a little bit and just thinking about what happens in a couple of cases when these objects are removed from their communities. Yeah. And so you described, there is a market in some sense or another for these objects. Yeah. And, the more you pay, the better the efficacy. What happens? I mean, I feel like these days you can go to any kind of garden center or whatever and pick up a statue of a Buddha.
Yeah.
And I wondered how your interlocutors feel about this use of these kinds of statues. And then on a more serious note, what are the implications? And I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit about what happens when these objects become curated in museums, and how do you negotiate those kinds of moves?
To the last part of your question, I could do a whole hour on that, but and there's a range of stuff. There are most of what ends, well, no, I can't generalize. Museums are getting more savvy and sensitive now. There's writing, for example, on if it's a consecrated Tibetan image, you can image it, do an X-ray and see if it has consecration material in it. If it has the consecration material in it, is it still carrying the charge or not? Do you call in a Tibetan monk to maybe revivify it or remove it or deal appropriately with it? It's at least as varied as the stuff I was talking about in answer to the last question. Museums are doing different things in different ways, but over the last 30 years, we have seen a huge uptick in the sensitivity of museums to the prior lives and meanings of the material in our care. In the American Museum of Natural History, we have deep in our storage something we call the smudge room. And it's a room where, among other things, Native Americans can come in, take sweet grass and purify objects, and it won't set off the smoke detector. The fire service will only respond to heat. And it's also been used by Tibetans, it's been used by visiting Siberians, it's a special sacred space set apart. The museum made that commitment to recognizing these needs. There are lots and lots and lots of stories that can be told about museum responses to the sacredness of objects, and I would say it's a growing consciousness. When we did our new Northwest Coast Hall, you would walk down the Anthropology corridor, the non-public space, and on the door of one of the conservators' areas, if this room contains shamanic objects, they may be dangerous to certain persons, please be aware. And then the empowered things were covered when they weren't being worked on, and it became a kind of laboratory culture that developed in consultation with the people who were the descendant community. And we all love it. I mean, this is anthropology, comes home, full circle. And then what was the first question?
I just wondered how your interlocutors felt about the, I guess, non-religious use of these.
Oh, non-religious use. Yeah, I think, again, you would find a huge range from the people who say, well, it wasn't made to be sacred, so who cares, to the people who are saying that's disrespectful and that's disturbing and that's only going to bring bad luck. I mean, just a range of stuff. What I've looked at, and I do mention a bit in the book, is things that fall into the art market, and when, where, and how that happens, and the stories that might arise around that, and some shamans who say, well, they know, the gods know that the shop isn't for them, the museum isn't for them, they take off, but. And with the statues, some general assumption, again, that they have been deactivated. And some dealers who will treat things with respect. I'd never put it on the floor. It goes on a shelf.
Can I ask you a little more about the materials going in the niches in the back of the statuary? I know a lot of work's been done in Chinese Buddhism for what's in. Can you say a little bit about the relationship in different countries or different figures between what goes in and the type of ensoulment or efficacy or anything on that line?
Okay, they will say, I mean, what I've heard is that even within Vietnam, it's highly variable. I haven't heard in Vietnam, for example, of putting, but, and then you compare and it's variable. But in general, it's 5 precious metals or substances. It's sometimes 5 colored strings, the colors of the cosmos, and some people say that's the intestines. a lot of amuletic material, sometimes metal. I have seen the interiors, the stuff come out of Tibetan statues that includes even things like watch bearings because they were probably the right metal, but I don't know for sure. I have heard there's been a lot of work done on this cache of statues in China that contain various materia medica related to the work the statue is supposed to do. In Taiwan, sometimes poisonous bugs and insects, and then some people say, but that's never for a Buddha, that's for the ones that are supposed to help you in business. No, that's aggressive. So no, highly variable but recognizable, where people say, oh yeah, unlike me, what? You put stuff in the statue and bring it to life, and I'd never heard of it. This is a very, comfortable acknowledgement across the span that I've been talking about.
So I'm interested in the combination of statues in this picture. I'm wondering, are they just a random bundle, or are they combined together to add up to the efficacy?
Are they combined too? They are the nut who have been identified as working with a particular medium on the basis of dreams, on the basis of the nut jaw goes to a festival and the music for a particular nut's played and he or she dances wildly and they say, oh, you've got to observe them. And then they get an image at some point. And the quest for the perfect image can be quite interesting too. There are different stories about finding the right statue.
Okay, why don't I just ask the last question, a more broader question about shamanism, and then we can close the event. So do you think shamanism is on the rise now? Because I think
it's on the rise. Oh gosh. It's so hard to quantify. If you had asked the reverse question, do I think it's dying out now? It's irrelevant. I'd say absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Okay.
It seems to be flourishing, but you have to weigh that against the degree to which it had to be underground at certain periods. So is it more now, or is it just more out in the open? I don't know. There are organizations in South Korea that claim they have statistics on shamans. I don't believe it. They have statistics on people who admit, people who've paid admission to a particular shaman organization. There are many, many more, I'm sure, than the statistics, but people also fall out of the practice, even though they're not supposed to. So I would just say, yes, it's emphatically not on decline.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, because I'm teaching Korean religion and culture course. Yeah. Often students say that their parents, although they are Catholic or Christians, they often consult with fortune tellers and shamans. So apparently, although they are not reveal their practice, but definitely a lot of people are practicing shamanism. Yeah. And then,
and there is also, here's something that might account for what seems like more. There are people who, 40 years ago, they would just call themselves a fortune teller, a diviner, and not a really initiated shaman. Nowadays, I think the impulse is to cast yourself as a shaman, to even wear robes and all, even know whether or not, these old ladies that I worked with would recognize them as shamans, because there's more cachet to it.
Great. On that note, thank you so much for your illuminating talk, and thank you so much for coming.